Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death and Analysis video, we are going to talk about the best item slots to craft legendary items on in 9.2. This includes talking about why this may matter to you, reviewing the current set of crafting considerations, and then going over the best general item slots to craft your legendary items on based on your individual circumstances. So, why does it matter where you craft your legendary items? What's in it for you? The first consideration is that crafting legendary items is fairly expensive, and even if you have a lot of gold, it would be nice to avoid wasting too much of it if at all possible. It also requires that you farm the required soul ash, soul cinders, and cosmic flux, which may or may not be a concern for you. Second, different combinations of tier set pieces compete for the same item slots as legendary items, so you can very easily run into a situation where you may need to choose between using a tier set bonus or a legendary effect, which is not a situation we'd like to be in, since that means that we'll need to recraft a new legendary item to solve this conflict. Granted, if gold and resources are not a concern for you, you can easily sidestep some of these issues by crafting multiple legendary items with the same power on multiple item slots. But I'm going to assume that that's a situation most people would like to avoid. Third, in both the short term and the long term, the specific item setup between tier set pieces and legendaries can have at least some impact on player power. This difference can either be large or small depending on your exact circumstances, but it's something to keep in mind regardless. So, if you are looking to save some gold, to avoid future hassle with unnecessary recrafting of legendary items, or to grab some low-hanging fruit for small power gains, this is a subject that may interest you. Now, let's take a look at the current situation we are dealing with at the start of patch 9.2, starting with how the tier set item slots overlap with legendary item slots. In case you haven't heard, our tier set bonuses are looking very strong, so we'll be strongly incentivized to use tier set pieces in 4 of the 5 slots that they are available in, which includes head, shoulders, chest, hands, and legs. If you are using the Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary, which is very strong in Mythic Plus and looking to be a competitive option in Raid, with the full tier set bonus active, we are only able to use this legendary on belt, shoulders, or gloves. Note, shoulders and gloves are also tier set item slots. Super Strain, on the other hand, can only be crafted on chest or neck, with chest being a tier set item slot. So, right away, we can see there are some potential issues. For our second legendary power, which is called Unity, we are able to use any item slot we want, which means our second legendary item has the potential to conflict with both our primary legendary item and our tier set bonuses. But we'll get back to talking about these item slot conflicts after going over a few other topics. Normally, when we are crafting a legendary item, we are concerned about a few factors in particular when we are choosing which item slot to craft them on. First, crafting a legendary item gives us an opportunity to optimize secondary stats over alternative items we may have, which could allow us to greatly improve the itemization of certain item slots and gain a lot of extra value. Second, we have the ability to put a high item level piece in a slot that we may not have a good high item level alternative for, which can make upgrading a specific item slot into a legendary a lot more appealing than it normally is. I won't be talking too much about these first 2 points in general because they're heavily dependent on what your current gear options are, but it's important to keep in mind that they can be very impactful under the right circumstances. Third is the fact that legendary items guarantee a socket on item slots that are capable of having a socket. This point is a lot more important in 9.2 than it was in 9.1 since, unlike patch 9.1, there isn't currently a way to manually add sockets to Season 3 items. While Blizzard might add in a way to socket gear later on, at least for the moment an additional item slot can very easily change your decision making. Again, this is dependent on what items you have available, since you may or may not have socketed alternatives. Finally, we have the fact that some item slots inherently give more stats than others, so everything else being equal, it's a better idea to put legendaries on these more valuable item slots, since the item level of legendary items is higher than anything else we can acquire in-game. At the bottom of this screen, you'll see a general ordering of which item slots are more valuable to gain item level on. If the name is bolded, that means that the item slot can be socketed. If the name is highlighted in gold, that means that it is a tier set item slot. If the item slot name is colored blue, you can craft Crimson Rune Weapon on the slot. And if the item slot name is colored purple, you can craft Super Strain on the item slot. It's also worth noting that anytime a greater than or equal to sign is used, the stat differences between the two item slots are extremely minor. So, for example, chest, legs, and head item slots all have nearly identical item budgets with only extremely small differences in their armor values. However, the difference in stats between chest and shoulders is a larger relative gap. Altogether, these factors take care of most of our crafting concerns, and I'm going to be referring to this item slot listing a lot for the rest of the video, because it simplifies the situation we are dealing with. However, there is one final factor we need to take into consideration. When it comes to gearing for PvE content, raid gear has a couple of advantages that you can't get with Mythic Plus gear. In short, killing the last 3 bosses in Sepulture of the first ones gives you access to several items that drop at a premium item level that can't be acquired anywhere else in the game. This gear is 7 item levels higher than standard Mythic item level gear. In particular, it's possible to get 4 out of 5 tier set items at this gear level once you take the Creation Catalyst into consideration, which includes every tier item slot but the head slot. It is also possible to obtain a ring and neck piece at these item levels, along with a few trinkets and a weapon, but those aren't as important when we are just looking at crafting considerations. While not a higher item level, there is also a ring off of Anduin that has a bonus effect for Death Knights, which puts it into a similar category. So, using this information, I have updated the item list so that item slots are underlined if premium item level gear is available in those slots. With all the previous information out of the way, we can now take a look at how we should approach the situation. There are a few circumstances we are going to consider going into this section. First, we are going to consider whether or not the player is rich or poor. Second, whether they are concerned with short-term power or long-term power. And third, whether or not the player is going to have access to loot off of the final 3 bosses from the Mythic Raid. In the short term, we are going to assume that the player has no control over what tier set items they have at their disposal, and even for capable players, loot from the final 3 raid bosses on Mythic won't be available. In the long term, the player will be available to choose which tier slots they want to use, though the player may or may not have access to premium raid loot from the end of Mythic Raid. If the player is poor, we'll assume that they want to minimize recrafting above all other priorities. If the player is well off, we'll assume that they have no issues with crafting multiple legendary items for short-term power gains, though in the long term, the player's gold situation isn't too important. In the first scenario, we're assuming the player is poor, but we're also assuming that they are concerned about their power in the short term. In this situation, both Crimson Rune Weapon and Super Strain have only one available item slot to craft that isn't on a tier set slot, so we don't really have much of a choice if we don't want to risk recrafting a legendary. As for the Unity legendary power, Boots is the next most valuable item slot, though if we wanted to use Super Strain, Belt can be a stronger short-term pick since it guarantees a socket if we don't have a socketed belt alternative. If we assume the player has a lot of gold at their disposal and they aren't afraid to use it, then the situation is very similar, but with one exception. You'll want to craft Unity on your most valuable item slot that isn't currently needed for tier set bonuses, regardless of what it is, and even if you need to craft multiple legendary items to make it happen. Helm is a very appealing item slot in the short term, assuming it isn't already being contested. Not only is it a high value item slot, but it can also guarantee a socket. If the chest slot happens to be available, Super Strain users have the additional option of crafting Super Strain on chest with a second legendary on boots or belt. These are all pretty specific circumstances in any case, and it's not something I'd be looking to do myself, but it's an option nonetheless. Now, let's look at the long term, assuming that you do not have access to premium raid loot. Now, we have the ability to craft one legendary in the tier set slot of our choosing, but only one. Since all of these item slots have the same item level without access to premium raid loot, the answer is pretty straightforward when using Crimson Rune Weapon. We're looking to craft Unity on Helm if a socketed tier helm continues to elude us, or if we do have access to a socketed tier helm, we have the option of crafting Unity on legs for a very marginal increase in total stats and secondary stat optimization. For Superstrain users, the situation with Unity is exactly the same. Now, if we have access to loot off of the last 3 raid bosses on Mythic difficulty, that simplifies the situation even more. Helm is the only slot where higher item level tier pieces are not available, and it still provides a guaranteed socket on a legendary. I did explore a few other possibilities, but even considering secondary stat optimizations, nothing looked better than crafting on Helm if you will have access to all items in the game. So, altogether, we can see that we'll probably want to be using Crimson Rune Weapon on belt or Super Strain on neck no matter what situation we're in, unless you are trying to cash in on some very situational, short-term benefits. As for the Unity Legendary, Boots is completely safe in the short term no matter what tier pieces you have available and what legendary you are using, while a Helm potentially sees use in all long-term setups unless you have a socketed tier Helm and have no plans on farming the last few bosses in Raid, which have the potential to make legs a marginally better choice. Again, this is just general guidance, and it's possible for character-specific item circumstances to situationally make other crafting strategies viable. In conclusion, we talked about how smart legendary crafting can give us an edge in player power and potentially save us gold in the long run. We reviewed all the considerations you may have when choosing item slots to craft our legendaries on, and we talked about some specific recommendations based on what your individual situation might be. If you would like to make it easier for other Blood Death Knights to find this content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, if there are any additional topics you would like to see in the future, or if you have any opinions of your own about where to craft legendaries in 9.2, leave a comment below or contact me through Discord. My information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.